Hey guys, welcome to this next video in our What Happens When You Give series. Nearing the end of the series now. By the time we finish, we will have done about 15 weeks of short videos teaching on this topic. And all these videos are available on YouTube. They're available online. So if you're fairly new to our church and you haven't been receiving the videos, make sure you give us your email address and we'll be able to make sure that we give you access to those videos. Just come and speak to me and I'll give you the links and show you where you can find these videos. I've been unpacking the theology of tithing and offering and why we are generous. We've talked about some practicalities, and over the next 2 weeks after this one, Pastors Edwina and Ivana are going to share a message each on this important issue of why we tithe, why we contribute to the house of God. And then on the last week in November, I'll wrap the series up, and can you believe it? We'll be at Christmas time before we know it. Hey, last week I talked about this book, God First, that Pastor Wayne Simpson from C3 Church Hong Kong had made available to pastors in Australian churches. And I just wanted to continue the story a little bit more today and talk about the next story that he gives in the opening chapter, in fact, of this simple little book. And you can buy a copy of this on a Kindle version, an ebook version. Just go to Amazon and type in God First Wayne Simpson. It's only about $6 or $7. It'll only take you about probably an hour to read if you sat down and read it in one setting. But it's also a very easy read and a very faith-building, inspiring read. So if you could read it in little snippets and just have your faith inspired around this area of tithing and giving to God's house and putting Him first in really in all areas of your life. And last week I talked about the story of the Garden of Eden and how God set aside that one tree and said to Adam and Eve, you cannot eat from that tree, that belongs to me, and how that was part of the God first principle that is throughout Scripture. Tithing is also part of that God first principle. Tithing isn't the only God first principle, but it is one of the many God first principles in Scripture. The very next story after the whole Garden of Eden and eating from the tree and the fall of humanity because they didn't put God first and try to do things their own way, that very next story we read about is the story of Cain and Abel and how they both brought offerings to God. And Wayne continues in this opening chapter and explains how that issue is also a put God first principle. Let me just read to you what Wayne says and we'll comment on it and then we'll take up our offering today. In Genesis chapter 4, it says, in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Not a bad thing, it would seem. He brought an offering to God. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. It tells me that we can actually bring an offering to God that God doesn't respect. Interesting, isn't it? So we just think, we're just, putting our money in or we're doing our thing. But God's looking beyond the amount or the format. He's looking for something deeper, and that's what Wayne alludes to in this passage. So don't be fooled into thinking just because we're offering that God automatically respects it. God is after something more. He's after this God-first principle. He's after this faith principle of trusting that if we put Him first, He will take care of everything else. So Wayne says, so why did God respect Abel's offering and not Cain's? Well, he says, I believe there are a couple of reasons. Firstly, Abel gave, quote, by faith, unquote. And faith is what pleases God. We know that, Hebrews 11:6. It says, in Hebrews 11:4, it says, by faith Abel brought a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. Faith always pleases God because it is fastened to a revelation about God, who He is, what He's done, rather than what we can do for ourselves. Secondly, Abel gave the first and the best portion. He says he gave the firstborn. Abel brought the firstborn, which was the first and the best of his livestock, to God. Wayne says, I believe that Cain should have brought to God the first fruits, the first and best portion of his harvest, but Cain didn't. He consumed the first fruits on himself and brought to God what was left over after a period of time. And other versions say Cain brought some of the fruit of his crops. So Cain brought something. His attitude behind it was, I better do something. I better give something. But Abel said, I can give the first, the best of what I have to God. This reveals a lot about faith and why faith is so pleasing to God. Faith points us toward God and away from ourselves. Faith reminds us of grace. That is, what God has done for us rather than what we can do for ourselves. Faith honors God with a worthy offering, whereas the absence of faith gives a token donation, reserving and consuming the best for ourselves. Faith reveals humility, selflessness, and generosity. The absence of faith motivated by fear leads to pride, selfishness, and a withholding spirit. So this principle of the tithe that we're talking about today is just that. The question is, what is our attitude behind it? I don't think it's so much about the amount. I do think God says 10%, and I've taught about that in this series, that 10% should be a minimum that we're giving to God, and we're inspiring unapologetically that you do your research and commit to that lifestyle and say, I'm going to give a minimum of 10% as a tithe. But beyond that, I think it's about faith. It's about our attitude that says, Lord, I am putting you first. I am trusting you, even though it doesn't make sense, even though I feel like I'm fearful that I'll be able to provide for myself, even though that I'm fearful that I'll be able to make ends meet. Faith says, I trust that God is the one who gives me the power to make wealth, as Deuteronomy says. Faith says, I trust that God is able to make up for my shortcomings. God is able to be more than enough for me. And so I'm going to set aside what I could use for me, for my provision. I'm going to put it to you, and I'm going to trust that you are my provider, you are my protector, and you can do a much better job of that than I can, God. That's what faith is. Okay, guys, I want to encourage you to keep faithful in your tithing, keep faith-filled in your tithing, keep believing that God is looking after you and saying, Lord, I'm not trusting myself, I'm trusting you to provide for me. And you can do that in buckets, you can do that via online, as most of you do, but don't let your online giving be a set and forget thing either. Remember, every time we have an opportunity for an offering, it's an opportunity to say, I'm in this, I'm up for this, I'm giving to God, I'm trusting him. And you can do that whether your money's gone in online or whether it's going in a bucket. Make sure you activate your faith. This is my way of saying I trust God. I'm putting God first, as this book says. God bless. See you next time.